It's time once again for another edition of Talk to Me. And now, here's Emmy himself, 8-time Emmy Award-winning journalist, Maynard Eaton.
Hello, my friends. Welcome to Talk to Me. This week, we honor the life and legacy of a civil rights legend, Dr. C.T. Vivian. Joining me is the man who gave the eulogy for Dr. Vivian yesterday. His name, of course, is Reverend Dr. Gerald Durley. Dr. Durley, welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for allowing me to share a few words with you today, Maynard.
Dr. Durley, at the CT's homegoing in your church yesterday, you talked about how C.T. Vivian had a good name. Could you explain that?
Well, basically, whenever you have the opportunity to try to share with a great listening audience around the world about a man who has meant so much to so many, for weeks at a time, you wonder, what should you say? Is there a biblical text that can summarize what his life meant? And you go through your mind and you wonder, who was it and how can you say it in a short period of time? So the text, Proverbs, the 22nd chapter, verse 1 and verse 4 came to mind, where it simply said that a good name is more valuable than riches and gold. And so CT's label on earth was C.T. Vivian, but his name was what he had done. So I wanted to say he had a good name. And the name was his integrity, his honesty, his decency, his love for justice, his fight for equality. That was his name, not Cordy Tinley Vivian. That was his label. So that's how I came up with the title, He Had a Good Name.
You also said that C.T. Vivian was infectious. Not only the smile, but how he impacted the world and everyone he interacted with.
CT, an infection is something that gets inside of you and begins to change the metabolic rate in your body, the blood flow. It's an infection. And a lot of times you don't even know you're infected. CT was like that. He would be with you and he'd laugh. But before CT laughed, he always smiled first. And then he would break into a great laughter. And you would break into a laughter with him. And you didn't even know what you were laughing about many times. But that's the infection that got inside of you. And what begins to happen after an infection, you get addicted. And all of those who were addicted by CT, they had a story. And even you, Maynard, everybody has a C.T. Vivian story. After he infects you, you become addicted. And then after addiction, you are in Vivian camp. And so I wanted people that day to know this. But what was very important to me yesterday was that in the city of Atlanta, for years and years, when they wanted to extol virtues on people and honors on people, they would roll out Maynard Jackson. They would talk about Herman Russell, Jesse Hill, John Lewis, Andy Young, Joe Lowry, and they would all, but you never really heard right in the mix the name C.T. Vivian, because he never looked for the limelight. He never tried to be in front of everybody. He was always saying, this is what Dr. King said, or what John Lewis said, and of the others receive all the awards. So I wanted to make sure yesterday that the Reverend Dr. Cordy T. Vivian received the highest honor and let people know exactly who the man was, not his name. His name was C.T. Who he was what I wanted to share yesterday. And his real name was more than riches and gold.
But also, he finally got his accolades from the state of Georgia and the city of Atlanta when he had a procession leading from the state capitol. He laid in state. You were there. He laid in state at the state capitol. And then there was a procession down Auburn Avenue, saluting him that ended at the King Center. There we are now at the state capitol. And you spoke then as well. What were your thoughts then when you were sitting there watching in the rotunda of the Georgia Capitol?
That's me.
There you are.
With the now. And my basic sentiments was this. 60 years ago, we couldn't even walk into the state capitol. And I said it publicly. 60 years ago, we could not walk into the state capitol. And here was C.T. Vivian stayed for 3 hours. Mr. Governor, this is an honor for you to be in his presence under the gold dome. He is the first non-elected African-American to lie in the state, in Georgia, which is an extreme high honor.
And then the procession down Auburn Avenue meant something because he stopped in front of SCLC where he was a former president.
Yeah, not only he was a former president, but more importantly, he was the first director of all the affiliates for the SCLC. Martin handpicked him to come in and organize across the states. You see Charles Steele there now, who is the current president, but CT was the first one and deliberately was asked to come in and organize affiliates all over the country. So we stopped there, and you see the President Charles Steele and his wife there at the horse-drawn carriage. But that's why it was so important to stop at that place where he had really founded when it was formulated originally.
You two were very good friends, confidants. In fact, you were his pastor, and which is an honor, I guess, since Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. called C.T. Vivian, as I understand it, the greatest preacher he'd ever heard. So 2 preachers in one church, that must have been something during your days together.
I often said, how can a pastor pastor the pastor of pastors? But when you're a friend, you don't think of it as passion. He was a mentor. He was a man of wisdom. He was one that he didn't have to say anything to you. When you were in his presence, there was a certain kind of gleaning that you picked from him. And he always taught from a Socratic method of teaching. What I mean by that, he asked you questions. If you thought you knew something, CT would say, Doc, hey, Doc, are you sure about that? And he would make you think. Your answer, he said, well, there's another way you might want to look at it. Wait, Doc. And when he called you Doc, you knew that you were a part of the circle. Even though he knew your name most of the time, he would call you. With women, they knew that CT was right with them when he called them sis. CT would be talking and he said, yes, sis, yes, sis. And people loved it. Whenever you were in his presence, you felt exclusive because he talked to you the same way he talked to Jim Clark down in Alabama. He would talk to you in 2020 to your face, and he drew you in. And that's what allowed him to be such a major force throughout the movement. What CT was, he was an intellectual strategist who was a gentle, loving warrior. And those are acts, kind of active, more kinds of conditions, because he was a lover and he was a warrior. He was serious and he had a great sense of humor. He was one that allowed things to flow. He didn't have to micromanage, but he was an excellent administrator. So when you put all of those things together, they were extremes on both sides. And that's what was the complexity of C.T. Vivian. And the real jewel is that he never had to be in the limelight. Most of us in today's world, we're narcissistic, we're myopic, and it's about me, me, me. That was never C.T. Vivian.
Well, at his 95th birthday party, he was in the limelight. And videographer Rick Clear and I covered that. You were there. Let's take a look. It was a who's who gathering of Atlanta's Black Mecca, a sold-out gala of 700 Atlanta business, political, and civil rights leaders to salute Reverend C.T. Vivian's 95th birthday and to honor his distinguished civil rights legacy. In an exclusive interview, I asked Dr. Vivian his thoughts about today's civil rights movement.
Oh, it's worth a lifetime. The whole thing. I mean, is that I'm just thankful to be even one part of the civil rights movement. We had waited for it. I was here so long ago that I appreciate the fact that we have.
Finally, they say you're the quintessential civil rights leader of our time. That takes in a lot of folks.
Yeah,
what do you say?
Well, I say it makes good copy.
Dr. Vivian and Ambassador Andrew Young are friends, former SCLC co-workers with Martin Luther King Jr., and two of Atlanta's 5 Medal of Freedom winners.
Well, let me tell you something. We think of the civil rights movement starting in 1955 with Dr. King and Rosa Parks.
Yes.
C.T. Vivian was leading sit-ins in Peoria, Illinois in 1947. See? And he is on the Freedom Rides. He trained Diane Nash and John Lewis and James Bevel. He and Jim Lawson organized that group that started the Nashville sit-in movement. And when Dr. King was called into Birmingham, we had almost no staff. There were just about 5 or 6 of us. And he said, we got to get some people who can help us with Birmingham. Birmingham is, well, there were 300,000 people there. And so we got CT to come down and join SCLC in '63 in Birmingham. And then he took over the director of all of our affiliates. And so he was all over the country organizing, training, and giving inspiration. He's one of the best preachers I've ever heard, and that includes Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, and anybody else.
You too?
Oh, I'm not in that class. But he's one of the people I envy, because he used to come home and go by Morris Brown when he was 70, 75, and run up and down the stadium steps. And that's why he's in such good shape. That's why I got a scooter. I didn't do that.
SCLC board chairman Bernard Lafayette shared these reflective sentiments of Vivian, who was warmly called the Quiet Warrior.
C.T. Vivian meant something very special to me. Our birthdays are one day apart. Mine was yesterday, the 29th. And it seems like we have something in common. And the most striking thing I remember was a speech he made in Chicago. He said, what kind of people do they think we are? And that was his repetition. And he tore it up. This was in Chicago.
Here in the city of Atlanta over the years, you always hear about Jesse Hill, and you hear about Herman Russell, you hear about Andy Young and John. C.T. was always, he never was jealous of anybody. He knew his role. He never told you who he was. And I think that's the strength of a C.T. Vivian that we all gain from him.
Atlanta City Council President Felicia Moore says today's leaders must pay homage to Dr. Vivian and others of his era.
Well, first of all, we have to pay homage to those who came before us. They have made Atlanta what it is and given me the ability as someone who's come to Atlanta to be able to enjoy the Black Mecca and to prosper in this great city. So I had to come and pay homage to him. He's CT Vivian is an institution here in the city of Atlanta and across the world, for the matter of fact. So for the new leadership and people that are coming before us, we always need to make sure that we're touching base with our roots, because it gives us context on where we need to go.
CT Vivian was a shining light, a likable pioneer in the civil rights movement. But Ambassador Andrew Young reminds us that Vivian was also a premier, primetime pulpit preacher who was much better than Martin Luther King Jr., he says, much better than Ralph David Abernathy, he says, and much, much better than me, he says. I'm Maynard Eaton reporting. That was a great tribute to a great man. Dr. Durley, what did he mean to the civil rights movement? What does he mean to the world now that he's gone?
It's interesting. We use these terms, he's gone. But in reality, C.T. Vivian will be larger in death than he was in life. Because in life, there were so many things moving around him and so many places he was. And in fact, Dr. King himself is larger in death than in life. I believe had Dr. King lived and lived to be in his 80s, he would have just been a person who made a lot of difference, but he'd have been around just another pastor. But his death at 39 heightened the reality of him being a prophetic leader. C.T. Vivian's words, his messages, the programs will be much larger. And I've seen it already happening because people are quoting what C.T. said. And I remember when and what he did at the UN and these kinds of things. So what he means to the world and the great lessons that I tell young people, one, good people do not always finish last. That you can be honest, you can move with integrity, you can have character, and you don't have to be a clown. You can be the kind of individual that you can speak truth to power without tearing up the power. CT knew how to take the power, speak to it, build upon it, and uplift the power and the powerless. That was CT's real strength. And I think as people began to look, they can take a formula for leadership and drape it for leadership around CT Vivian. That's what his institute is about now with the young boys that he's training through the CT Vivian Leadership Institute. But he was not only doing it with young boys, he was doing it with the people in the movement, and he was also doing it to corporations. He was also doing it to powerful government entities. What's key, CT had the first major nonprofit culturally diversity program that was breaking down barriers between black and whites. And here in the city of Atlanta, it's called Basics. And Basics was used to bring black and white and other minorities together to confront racism back in the early 90s and late 80s. And because of that, he impacted mayors, he impacted business people, he impacted teachers, because every year under the Leadership Atlanta program, CT did the training after a man named Dr. Claude King and Charles King did it. CT came in, but CT confronted people in a positive, constructive, strategic way. That will be the legacy of CT in this city, because there are people now who are making major decisions, including mayors, many city council persons, some of the senators and representatives. They came through CT Vivian's basic diversity training program.
You've been overwhelmed, you told me earlier, by the response to your eulogy and calls about what you two meant to each other and to the movement. Tell us about some of the responses you've gotten to your eulogy.
I think that, which is amazing to me, because I was saying to my wife, a eulogy of this nature, and many pastors or whoever the eulogist might be, you're prone, unless you're very careful, to elevate yourself by saying, right. CT and I never wanted to say anything about me. What I wanted to do there was to elevate CT and who he was and his good name. And in doing that, people will get another perspective of who this man really was. So in the whole idea of the eulogy to walk away with, I wanted people to leave with the idea that you can find a goal, find a purpose, be who you are. Don't allow the purpose to define you. You define the purpose. And when you define the purpose, other people with like purposes will come to you and you'll have a movement. CT never, ever, I've never heard him, and no one's ever said it, say a negative word about anybody. If he didn't like you, including Jim Clark, who beat him up on the Dallas County steps in Selma, here's what he said about Clark. He said, you know, we need to pray for that man. All he was doing was job at that time. That's the kind of impact and message that CT emulated to all of us.
Dr. Durley, you had quite an impact.
He was the embodiment of something that he lived for, and that was, he never veered from it, the concept of nonviolence.
Dr. Durley, you've had a distinguished career yourself.
We live in a world now that's violent. And another thing I said in my message, because CT had an opportunity to live in the time of Black Lives Matter, where streets are being covered. People are marching out once again. And we talked about it. And this is probably one of the most optimistic times in America. When Emmett Till was killed, when Rodney King was killed, when Rosa Parks marched, even when Martin died, 2 or 3 weeks afterwards, the burning of the cities took place. But there is something, because of the diversity and the timing, that this is a very unique moment in time. When they take down flags, NASCAR, and take down statues, that's because of it coming together. But what I'm afraid of, Maynard, and I don't say this in a prophetic way, unless we are very careful as a people, the white folks who joined in with us, the white young people, they're there now. But unless we begin to say Black Lives Matter, even when white cops don't put their knee on our neck, even when white cops don't beat us up, Black lives still matter. And therefore, we must understand that we now must be responsible for our lives. During this period, more Black folks have killed Black folks. Yesterday, 2 shootings here in Atlanta, Black folks on Black folks. Now, if lives really matter, then we need to begin to take the responsibility. Now, there will be Black folks that will say, Durley, you're blaming the victim. No, no, no. They will say, we're poor, we didn't get education, inaccessibility to health care, and an unjust system. We cannot blame what we're doing to other people on the variables that come in on our life. Some of the poorest countries in the world have the lowest crime rate because they did what we did. When we were poor, we shared. When we were poor, we didn't even have to lock our doors. When we were poor, everybody took care of everybody's children on the block. But seemingly the more we got and took on a major cultural attitude, we got worse and worse on each other, kind of almost a self-hate. So we've got to change that, because we got a 3 to 6 month window before white folks and others say, wait a minute, if they don't believe Black Lives Matter, why should we? And they will go back and we will have missed another opportunity. We now must work along with others from other races and other ethnic groups, other faiths, to get stronger. And while we're doing that, go into our community and begin with our own young men and our own young women. I mean, we've lost that core that says we are, I hate to be so cavalier, we are somebody. We do have a history. We do have pride. We do have character. But that's being clouded over now, and we have a level of personal and communal self-destruction now. That is not, and it cannot be us. This is our moment to make a difference. And when legends like John Lewis and C.T. Vivian and Joe Lowry and so many others go on, now we've got to pick up the mantle. We will be meeting with Black Lives Matter young people. I'll be meeting with them and telling them now, you've got to have a purpose. You've got to have a goal. Don't tell me we don't have a leader. You've got to have some leader. Otherwise, you're going a lot of directions. Can you imagine? I'm going to get on a plane and I don't need a captain. How far will you go?
Right.
I'm not. So choose the leader that you have, follow that leader, give that leader the ideas, and then go in a direction and have a goal, have a mission, have a purpose. Then Black lives begin to matter, because now Black lives matter to us. And when Black lives matter to us, everybody will get on board. It's very critical. Everybody saying, man, look at all of the diversity out. Look at the white folks are now with us. But understand why white folks are with us right now. Many believe that our cause is right. But right now, white folks are understanding what we said all along, because they're not getting the kind of education they want because of coronavirus. Their jobs are being lost because of coronavirus. Their health care, they can't go into the hospital because of coronavirus. So if you look at health, education, and health education and the business economy, they are just where we have been saying for the last 100 years. So we're in this. So now we're saying, let's work through the educational complexities, the health complexities, and the job. If we don't work together this time, they're going to go back to their camp. We're going to go back to our camp, and the kumbaya meetings will be dead.
Dr. Durley, wow. Thank you for sharing those wise words of wisdom. You are a preacher. And you're also a leader in your own right. You've been in the civil rights and human rights movement all your life, too, after leaving Tennessee State. And now you're involved with environmental issues as well, are you not, sir? I mean, you've had quite a history yourself.
Movement 60 years ago in 1960. I was president of the student government in Nashville, Tennessee. In 1963 at the march, I had all of us there in August marching I was a foot soldier at the March on Washington. And then I came back to Nashville, 1963, 64, and I was SGA president. And we got back to school on August the 29th. We were organizing, talking about what we're going to do in September, October. And then the big bomb hit. On November the 22nd, John Kennedy was killed. And we wondered, now, wait, 2.5 months ago, we were in Washington, and now the president is dead. And I had to deliver it wasn't a eulogy, we just called it an assembly, and talk about we cannot quit, we cannot back up or bend or bow. We've got to keep moving ahead, even though John Kennedy was dead. So yes, I've been in it quite a long time. It's over 60 years. But as I said, I feel more optimism right now about what we're doing. But meantime, about 10 years ago, I got involved with something that is much larger than the pandemic. I believe this pandemic is only the precursor to the real destroyer of all of us, unless we do something, and that's climate crisis, climate change. One virus has shut down the world. Can you imagine if we don't do something in terms of carbon dioxide in the air? I don't care how many laws we have on the books. When Mother Nature, if you will, decides to rise up, there is no antibiotic to that. When the oceans rise up on the West Coast and on the East Coast, and cities are going underwater, and then where it's not flooding, the wildfires are burning. Where the wildfires are not burning, hurricanes and tornadoes are coming through. And if you take all of that out and you're standing outside with no home, you're flooded or you're burned out, then the earth starts to shake under your feet. And that's because of what we're doing and what we're putting into the air. And you say, let's run out and get some water. We're thirsty, but all the water is polluted and the air is toxic. That is something that we've got to mitigate against now. And it's interesting, in the African American community, we don't talk about climate change because we've got other priorities. We've got to bring this now front and center, and particularly from the church pulpits where Black people attend, because God created us to be stewards of the earth. He said, take care of my earth and I will give you everything that we need. We're not doing that now. The Indians understood that. They would kill a buffalo, eat the meat, and put the hide to make housing. And they never wasted anything. We've become a society of throwaways. We throw away plastic plates. We throw away plastic spoons. We throw away too much food, and we throw away each other. So we take it, we just throw away. So we've got to come back and be conservationists. I didn't say conservative, I said conservationist with what God has given us. So the church now must speak to those virtues about how do we preserve the bounty that God has blessed us with. It's sad the kinds of food every day that's thrown away in hotels right here in Atlanta and around the world. Tons and tons of food, yet people are starving. God is not pleased with that. So we now must go back, as our ancestors did, and begin to conserve what it is that we have and begin to do something very strange and weird now. Do something that we got to learn to do again. And that's called share.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've been listening to Dr. Gerald Durley, a one-of-a-kind man who has taught us lessons today as he has throughout his 60-year career in the civil rights movement. Dr. Durley, thank you so much. I really appreciate your eulogy for C.T. Vivian, but also your words of wisdom for us today. See you next week.
And let me say to you, all of us in the movement, during the movement, wherever you've been, you've always brought the issues and honesty to what needs to be said. The kinds of questions you ask, people don't realize how difficult your job is to ask the kinds of questions that would get to elicit the kind of information that can enlighten people. And I'm convinced you can't do that until you do what you say. And you know what that is? Talk to me.
See you next week. Thank you.